Did you know that in terms of GDP per capita, Switzerland is the third richest country in the world? That's right. Switzerland has a total GDP per capita of $94,835. The only two wealthier countries by that metric are Luxembourg, with a total GDP per capita of $128,820, and Ireland at $106,998. For reference, the three poorest countries in the world by GDP per capita are Malawi at $483, Sierra Leone at $472, and Burundi at $308. However, it's not just GDP per capita that indicates how wealthy Switzerland is. A 2020 report released by Credit Suisse found that Switzerland has the highest wealth per adult out of any other country in the world. In fact, the average income in Switzerland is, get this, over $696,000. Furthermore, the nation has approximately 800,000 millionaires. For a country with a population of only 8.7 million people, that means that a whopping 9% of the population is made up of millionaires. To put that into perspective, there are 56 million millionaires in total in the world, so Switzerland holds about 1.4% of the world's millionaires, despite only having about 0.1% of the world's population. Finally, despite what seems like every country in the world dealing with increasing inflation, Switzerland has somehow managed to stay relatively immune to this. While its neighboring European countries have seen inflation rise to double-digit numbers, inflation in Switzerland only rose to 3.5% in 2022. In other words, Swiss incomes are not being destroyed by inflation, and so people here still enjoy relatively high purchasing power. Okay, I think it should be clear by this point that Switzerland is a pretty wealthy country, but have you ever wondered why it's so wealthy? And how it accumulated this wealth in the first place? After all, the country is pretty tiny, with, again, only about 8.7 million people, and has little in the way of natural resources. Well, today and across the globe, we're going to be looking at this and delving into all the reasons behind why Switzerland is so rich. I think reasons number 4 and 5 will be especially surprising to you. To start out, we need to first travel back in time. Reason number 1, history of industrialization. Switzerland hasn't always been a wealthy country. It actually accumulated its massive amounts of wealth relatively recently, and a large part of that has to do with its history of industrialization, a history that has positioned Switzerland as one of the leading industrialized nations in all of Europe. The spark for all of this was Switzerland's textile industry, which took off in the 1800s. Of particular prominence was embroidery, which by 1912 accounted for 18% of Switzerland's total exports and a massive 50% of the world's total production of embroidery. But it wasn't just goods that came out of this period. Switzerland's focus on textiles also led to the invention of machines that advanced the industry as a whole. The creation of these innovative textile machines then paved the way for the production of other machines, such as turbines and generators, allowing Switzerland to become even more of a manufacturing powerhouse. But things didn't stop there. Swiss textile companies also spearheaded the development of tar dyes, which then gave birth to a booming chemistry industry and an even more lucrative pharmaceutical sector. By the mid-19th century, Switzerland had become the second most industrialized country in all of Europe, after only England. This early industrial boom has paved the way for Switzerland's thriving manufacturing industry today. Currently, manufacturing makes up a massive 18.7% of the country's GDP, and trade and repair make up an additional 14.8%. Now, it isn't just manufacturing, trade, and repair that have led to Switzerland's strong economy. Finance has been another major industry, and that leads us to reason number 2, Swiss banking. You've probably seen plenty of movies where a millionaire character goes to their extravagant Swiss bank to tend to their piles of gold. But this isn't just something that Hollywood cooked up. Swiss banks have historically been known as popular places for the world's wealthiest individuals to stockpile their money. This is the case for two reasons: the security offered by the banks and, until recently, the strong privacy protections. In terms of security, the Swiss economy and, in turn, the Swiss franc have historically been incredibly stable. For instance, remember when I told you that in 2022 inflation rose to 3.5%? Well, that was a 29-year record high for the nation, indicating just how stable Switzerland's economy has been. So, because of this stability, many people have chosen to keep their money in a Swiss bank rather than in their own country. Others have turned to Swiss banks to protect their funds from economic turmoil due to wars or even from being confiscated by their own governments. In addition to security, Swiss banks also have strong privacy protections, leading them to be favored by clients seeking anonymity with their financial transactions, like those trying to evade taxes. While these privacy protections were relaxed in 2009 due primarily to pressure from the US and the European Union, people have continued to place their money in Swiss banks. And as you can imagine, storing the millions and millions of dollars of some of the world's wealthiest people means that the banks in turn have only grown richer. The amount of money in these Swiss banks is no joke. In 2021, customers had stashed over $2.4 trillion of offshore wealth in these Swiss banks, and at the end of 2021, total banking sector assets were 3.9 trillion Swiss francs, which, to put that into perspective, is over 520% Switzerland's GDP, making it the highest among developed countries. And of course, the banks aren't just holding these people's money free of charge. They're also making a pretty little penny off of these huge assets. For instance, Switzerland's finance sector generates over 10% of the country's total GDP. For comparison, in neighboring Germany, that number is only around 3.9%. So this is yet another piece in the puzzle that helps us understand why Switzerland is such a wealthy country. Reason number 3: favorable tax policies. Speaking of the wealthy and their large bank deposits, another major reason for Switzerland's status as one of the world's richest countries is due to its favorable tax policies. These benefits extend both to corporations and to individuals, leading many wealthy companies and high net worth people to relocate to Switzerland, which in turn further boosts the country's GDP. To understand how this works, let's take a look at Ireland as an example. As you might remember, Ireland is the second wealthiest country in the world according to its GDP per capita. And a major reason for Ireland's wealth is because the nation has adopted extremely favorable tax policies for corporations and has overall developed a pretty pro-business environment. This in turn has led many major companies to flock there in recent years. For instance, Accenture and Medtronic, which have annual revenues of $31.79 billion and $56.7 billion respectively, are both headquartered in Ireland. As a result, Ireland has seen a major rise in its GDP per capita. Now, Switzerland has seen a similar effect on its economy by also offering a very pro-business environment for large corporations. This not only includes low tax rates, but confidentiality, which is a major draw for those companies who are looking to keep their numbers top secret. All of this has led to many big companies to relocate their headquarters to Switzerland. And by big, I'm not exaggerating. For instance, Nestlé, Zurich Insurance Group, and Credit Suisse are all based in Switzerland. These companies have annual revenues of over $102 billion for Nestlé, nearly $42 billion for Zurich Insurance, and over $15 billion for Credit Suisse. As we saw in Ireland, these companies not only contribute to the economy through job opportunities, but also contribute significantly to the country's GDP. And a recent report from McKinsey shows just how impactful this can be. This report found that the overall business sector, which includes large corporations, sole proprietorships, and partnerships, contributes 72% of GDP in OECD economies. It's not too relevant, but in case you want to know, OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and is a multilateral organization that has 38 member countries that work together to promote economic growth, prosperity, and sustainable development. And you can bet that those companies that are making over $1 billion in revenue, as we saw with Nestle, Zurich Insurance Group, and Credit Suisse, are playing a major role in the contribution to the 72% we mentioned earlier. Switzerland not only has favorable tax policies for businesses, though. The nation also offers favorable policies to high net wealth individuals. In Switzerland, these people enjoy some of the lowest tax rates in the world. For instance, the millionaires I mentioned earlier are allowed to simply pay a lump sum amount on their assets that are held in Swiss banks, and voila, their taxes are considered paid. Because of this, Switzerland has often been dubbed a tax haven, and the wealthy people who flock here are in turn financially contributing to the economy. And the number of wealthy people located here isn't small. If you remember from earlier, Switzerland is home to about 800,000 millionaires, but it's not just the wealthy who live here. The ultra-wealthy do too. In fact, about 40 billionaires are estimated to live in Switzerland. For a country with a population of about 8.7 million, that's pretty significant. Now, all of this talk of wealth leads me to my next point, which is in many ways the polar opposite of what we've been talking about so far. Reason number 4, poverty deportation. While Switzerland's policies have benefited its wealthiest individuals, they haven't always advantaged its poorest residents to this same degree. In fact, Switzerland has had strict welfare policies throughout its history. In the 20th century, for instance, Switzerland implemented a policy surrounding foreign workers and their employment status. While the nation has historically welcomed foreign workers, their residence was heavily dependent upon their employment. If a foreign worker found themselves unemployed for an extended period of time, for example, they risked deportation under Swiss law. The severity of this law might have been best demonstrated during the economic crisis of the 1970s. During this time, Switzerland took the drastic measure of deporting over 200,000 foreign workers to try and manage the economic downturn. This trend extended well beyond the 1970s, however, until only recently, Switzerland enforced strong welfare regulations, especially for expats. For example, a recent policy dictated that expats who lived in Switzerland for over 15 years and relied heavily on government benefits could risk deportation. As a result, some have avoided seeking Social Security or other government benefits out of fear of deportation. Although this policy has recently been softened by historically offering fewer benefits to some of its residents, Switzerland has managed to conserve its financial resources even more. All right, let's look at the next reason. Reason number 5, neutrality in war. You probably remember from your history class as a kid that Switzerland has historically remained neutral during major wars. But do you know how that's impacted the country economically? To look at this, we're going to be focusing primarily on the World War II era, which threw most of the world, with the exception of Switzerland, into chaos. During World War II, as you likely already know, Switzerland abstained from conflict and remained neutral. But this wasn't just about politics. There was an economic strategy behind it. For instance, while other nations were engaged in battles and were spending huge amounts on their war efforts, Switzerland took advantage of its neutrality. The country became a major player in the gold market, purchasing massive amounts of gold from both the Allied and Axis powers. For instance, the Reichsbank, which was Germany's central bank at the time, reportedly sold gold worth 1.2 million francs to the Swiss National Bank. Another estimate says that the Swiss National Bank acquired up to $400 million worth of German gold in total during the war, an amount that would be worth billions today. But the Axis powers weren't the only sellers. France, Britain, and even the US sold gold to Switzerland, with transactions amounting to 189 million, 673 million, and 2.24 million francs worth of gold, respectively. As you can imagine, Switzerland benefited heavily from this gold exchange, and this, coupled with its lack of spending on wartime efforts, contributed to its wealth building. I will note that, as you can imagine, Switzerland has endured quite a bit of controversy for this piece of its history, and recently, it tried to make right on this by doling out reparations payments in acknowledgement of these past dealings. Now, coming back to the present day, it's apparent that Switzerland has continued the strategic balance between wealth building and military expenditure. Unlike many countries, Switzerland doesn't allocate a large chunk of its GDP to its military. While the US allocates 3.48% of its GDP on military expenses, for instance, Switzerland spends a mere 0.73% of its total GDP. Furthermore, its neutrality during war has been a key contributor to its development as one of the world's most stable economies. What about why so few Americans live in the western part of the country? Watch this video to learn about that.